Good morning and welcome. This morning I'm delighted to welcome both members and friends of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, and the Council on Intelligence Issues, with whom we're partnering this morning on this event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is a nonpartisan think tank and a registered 501c3. For those who are new to us, and I see we have a lot of newcomers this morning, we're based in Philadelphia. We're, as I mentioned, a nonpartisan think tank, and we've been around since the 1950s. We began life as part of the University of Pennsylvania, but we have, since our beginning, we became independent in the 70s, but since our beginnings, we've been committed to delivering expert analysis and research and education to policymakers and the public at large. As I often say, we're all about delivering the story behind the story, but in an evidence and fact-based way, and also in a very civil way. I'd also, before we get started, like to thank our sponsors and members and partners for their support, without which we could not do what we do. If you are, as I say, new to us, please check us out on our website, www.fpri.org, where you'll see a lot of articles and we also recordings of our events, our past events. A few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, if you scroll down, you'll see a Q&A button on the far right. If you have questions, feel free to put them in that, because we'll have a question and answer period about halfway into the program. And I see there's already a question. The chat box at the bottom of your screen, you can also use that too. That's, though, not for questions. That's for if you have a technical problem or a question you want to ask us. And we'll also be posting a link to our website where you can also, if you choose to become a member and or support us, you can do that there. This morning, I'm going to turn this over to John Gannon, who is the chairman of the board of directors of the Council on Intelligence Issues. John is no stranger to many in our audience, as he had a long and distinguished career in both the public and private sectors. He rose to be the director of analysis director of the analytical directorate at CIA. He was also the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, the NIC, until 2001. After his retirement in 2001, he served in the White House as the head of the intelligence team that stood up the Department of Homeland Security, and later on the Hill as the staff director of the House Select Committee on Homeland Security. In 2005, he joined the UK-owned BAE Systems, where he served until his retirement as president of the $1.7 billion intelligence and security sector. He has received numerous awards, including CIA's Distinguished Intelligence Medal, Director's Medal, Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, as well as being awarded by President George W. Bush the National Security Medal, the nation's highest intelligence award. He's on the boards of several nonprofit organizations and a retired Naval Reserve officer and a Vietnam veteran. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to John Gannon to say a few words.
Thank you very much, Raleigh. I appreciate that maybe overly long introduction. I want first of all to thank you, Raleigh, for inviting us here this morning. We're really honored to be partnering with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and presenting this panel of distinguished intelligence professionals. We have known the Institute for decades, first for the publication of its quarterly journal, Orbis, which is for many of us a rich source of always informative and often provocative articles on U.S. foreign policy. But we also know that CII shares a strong commitment to public education with an institute known for its educational outreach in the Philadelphia area and nationally. But when in Philadelphia, particularly to students and teachers in the region. This really is a proud heritage. Okay, are we all right?
Yes.
Okay, so this really is a proud heritage for the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And by the way, I've always recognized that the word research is very critical in their title, because that really is the value proposition I think that they provide and the great work they do. CII is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, charitable, and educational organization founded in 2010 by two former CIA officers, George Jamieson and Bill Murray, to provide advice on legal resources to CIA and other intelligence community officers wherever they reside in the world or serve in the world, who need information about legal options in general or about cleared attorneys in particular, who may be able to provide free, independent legal advice. We also, like the Foreign Policy Research Institute, have an educational mission to educate the public about intelligence and other important national security topics. We focus generally on the challenges and risks, legal, operational, analytical, and political, facing intelligence officers every day. And for more information about the Council on Intelligence Issues and future events, into some videos that we have of previous panel discussions that we have sponsored, we invite you to visit the CIA's website at www.intelissues.com or .org, or write to CII@intelissues.org. So now it's my pleasure to introduce a man who is really, there is no finer scholar or practitioner of intelligence than Dr. Mark Lowenthal. He's a lecturer and author of the book Intelligence from Secrets to Policy, which I believe is completed its 9th edition, as one of, I think, the most popular books on the intelligence community, both within the U.S. government and its agencies and in academia. He's President Emeritus of Intelligence and Security of the Intelligence and Security Academy. He's former Assistant DCI, Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production, Vice Chairman of Evaluation for the National Intelligence Council, and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence Staff Director for the 104th Congress. I should also add, you probably gave me this line, that he also there's several Jeopardy appearances a few years back, where he was the tournament champion, which did not surprise all of us who know his mastery of detail, esoteric and otherwise. But I'm also a pleasure to introduce him as a valued colleague and good friend to all of us in the intelligence community, Dr. Mark Lowenthal. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, John. And welcome to everybody. Glad you could join us for this panel. I'll introduce my fellow panelists here. Peter Clement was chief of CIA's presidential transition team in 2008. He was also a PDB daily briefer for Vice President Cheney, for National Security Advisor Condi Rice, and for her deputy, Steve Hadley. Dawn Eilenberger was the deputy DNI the deputy director of national intelligence and assistant DNI for policy and strategy. Dawn also managed the DNI's presidential transition effort in 2016. John Mclaughlin, former deputy director and acting director of Central Intelligence, has briefed candidates, president-elects, and sitting and former presidents. And John Mosman was the chief of staff to the director of Central Intelligence, the CIA's director of congressional affairs, and he also served as senior advisor to the DNI's transition teams for the last 3 presidential transitions. We know that a lot of our friends and former colleagues are in the audience, and we thank you all for being there. We can't recognize all of you, but we would like to just call out a couple of good friends. Dick Kerr, former deputy director and acting director of Central Intelligence. Charlie Allen, who's had every job imaginable in the intelligence community, way too many to mention. Larry Pfeiffer, who was chief of staff to Mike Hayden and now runs the Hayden Center at GMU, which also puts on some terrific sessions. And Andrew Hallman, who was a PDB briefer for President Bush and ran the CIA's Directorate for Digital Innovation, a new directorate. So welcome to all of you, and I apologize to our other friends and colleagues. It's a long list. We're glad to have you with us. So we're going to talk today about this issue of briefing presidential candidates. This is a politically sensitive process. We clearly will not be getting into any classified information here. We want to explain how the process works typically, where the process is today. A little background, this process and tradition began in 1952. President Truman, reflecting on how little he had been told before he suddenly became president in April 1945, he knew nothing about the Yalta talks, he knew nothing about the atomic bomb project. When he decided not to run for another term, he was still eligible. He turned to his DCI, Walter Beadle Smith, and said, maybe we should offer briefings to the presidential candidates. And Smith thought that was a great idea, so General Eisenhower and Governor Stevenson offered briefings. Truman even invited them to join a cabinet meeting. Only Stevenson agreed to do it. And the process has taken place every 4 years. It is a dynamic process. It depends a lot on the politics of the year. It depends on who's running. It depends on who's in the White House. So in some elections, you have two candidates, neither of whom are president yet. One of them is going to win. And so this is also important for the intelligence community. This is our opportunity to make a first impression on whoever it is we'll be reporting to. And you only get to make a first impression once. The process is not mandatory. Walter Mondale declined briefings, Bob Dole declined briefings, but pretty much there are briefings. And so we want to get into this process, how it works, some lessons learned. So John Mclaughlin, let me start with you. Who gets briefed? What gets briefed? How is that all set up and decided?
Well, of course, the candidate gets briefed, and this is a little different, of course, in a year when one of the candidates is a sitting vice president. That was true when Vice President Gore ran against candidate and Governor Bush. So Gore did not need to be briefed. He had that happening every day in his normal position, but candidate Bush had to be briefed, and I did that. Also, I've briefed John Kerry in 2004, his running mate, John Edwards. And then my own personal experience was briefing President Clinton, President-elect Clinton, for 3 months in Little Rock, Arkansas, after the election. But looking at the election period and the candidates, of course, it's the candidate. And then the candidate often wants someone to be with them. And this, in the past at least, has been negotiated, although I think some of my colleagues will say that it is now more formally established who can accompany that candidate. But typically they will want someone with them who is somehow involved in the campaign on national security. Thinking back to the briefing of candidate Bush, he wanted Condi Rice and Paul Wolfowitz with him. They were both advisors at that time and obviously came into his government. He also wanted Josh Bolten, who was his domestic policy advisor, and there was quite a bit of discussion within the Clinton administration about whether Bolton should be included. Some arguing, no, he shouldn't be. He's a domestic policy person. We argued on the intelligence side that he probably should because clearly the candidate relied on him and trusted him. And this was part of that point you made, Mark, about getting off on the right foot with a candidate. Plus, we made the case that there were ties developing and clear between domestic policy and foreign policy. So Bolton was included as well. Someone like John Kerry necked that down to his national security advisor at the time, who was Rand Beers. And I think I briefed Kerry 2 times at least in different parts of the country. You travel around and meet them wherever they are. One was Louisville, one was Boston. And Rand was there all the time, and he was the only person in the room with Kerry. And sometimes the candidates will give you questions in advance. This was particularly true with John Kerry. We got a whole list of questions that came to us and were negotiated with him, but of course, whatever he asked, we sought to answer. And there are many more things that my colleagues will bring out. One other point I would mention is obviously you prepare elaborately for these events, but you often find that your preparation has to go out the window because ultimately you respond to what works for them. People absorb information in different ways. For example, with candidate Bush, I had a big, thick briefing book. We covered every part of the world. I got about 5 minutes into it, and it was pretty clear he just wanted to have a conversation, and the book went aside, and that conversation went on for about 4 hours. And it varies with every candidate. Some are more systematic than others. John Kerry was very systematic, had a list, went down them. We went through everything. So essentially, that's who gets briefed. and some of the mechanics of the process, which evolve over the years, as you will hear.
All right, thanks, John. Dawn, how does it actually get set up from the intelligence community side of the story?
Well, first of all, we do request permission from the White House to do the briefing. We send a memo to the Chief of Staff. It is more formal now. I think when the DNI took over the process, they wanted to have the formal authorizations. And so a memo was sent to the Chief of Staff with the list of topics that the intelligence community intends to offer to the candidates for briefings. Once the Chief of Staff approves that, we do this on a nonpartisan basis. We do not go back to them. We keep it very close held on how the briefing goes. We don't share atmospherics. We don't share questions the candidate had. We keep it on a very nonpartisan basis. So that really is the formal piece of it. And the White House does get involved. John mentioned the post-election period when he briefed the president-elect. We also asked the White House, what are the rules on who gets the PDB? In recent years, it's been a fairly broad category as people are picked that they're going to be nominated for senior national security positions. We'll ask the candidate, do you want them to have a PDB? You ask the White House, and you start PDB briefings during that time. When are you going to brief on covert actions and other operational activities? So all those questions you do run by the White House. But it is a little more formal now than before, but it's still nonpartisan, and it's still very, the actual contact with the candidates is treated as privileged information.
John Mosman.
To follow on Dawn's point about the more formal process, in 2008 and 2016 and 2012, the memorandum to the Chief of Staff really outlined the ground rules upon which the briefings would be given. And Dawn mentioned a few of them. One very important one is that the briefers would not report back to the White House anything that was said during the briefing, any question or discussion. The other ground rules, typically to John Mclaughlin's point, would be one or two staffers in the briefing. We wanted to avoid the circumstance where you'd have a room full of people listening to all of this. No policy matters would be discussed, and if a policy question arose, the candidate would be advised to contact the National Security Advisor to have a discussion about that. And no operational matters either, which actually came up a few times during the campaigns when there were some operational things going on around the world that were newsworthy, but we simply didn't want to get into that with the candidates. The same ground rules that were agreed to by the Chief of Staff were then sent to the campaign staff. And so everybody was fully aware of the ground rules going into this situation.
The irony here is that each White House at one point was a candidate. And yet when they become the White House, there's sort of this interesting amnesia about what happened when they were on the other side of the issue. Peter, who does how do the briefers get selected?
Wow, that's a complicated one. Can I add a footnote to what you just said, though, Mark and John, which is if one of the candidate recipients of the briefing has a series of questions or has a follow-on brief, the fact that that session occurred is conveyed to the other side. So that
right.
Correct, John?
Yeah, if in a non-incumbent race, 2008 and 2016, that's exactly right. In fact, the topics that would be selected and offered to the candidates would be offered in identical email messages. And the other part of that message is that if one candidate wanted a different topic, that would be offered to the other side as well. There was an absolute intensity to keep this nonpartisan, not favoring one after the other. Yeah.
Thanks, John. So on the selection of the briefers, recently that's done via the DOD&I. And they scour around for nominees from the different agencies. I won't get into the details of which ones, but they do seek nominees from the various agencies. And they actually have a pretty serious interview process for the briefers. It's a big deal to take on this duty. And John Mclaughlin may be better positioned based on his experience, but if you can imagine briefing for 4 hours without your notes, you actually have to have the right person in the room. And
Absolutely.
it has to be more than a deep expert in one area. You need somebody who can cover the waterfront and pick up a lot of material very quickly. John, was that your experience?
Yes, but I was not foolish enough to go alone. I was pretty good on most parts of the world that I understood these candidates to be interested in. But for example, when I briefed candidate Bush, I took with me our principal China expert, known to most of you. And I took also a very senior person on counterterrorism, because I wanted to make sure on those particular issues, if we had to go deep, I had someone who could go deep. I was comfortable on all of the other things, Russia and so forth and so on, and the Middle East and Asia and so forth. But on those two, I wanted, and they were very important briefings. The terrorism briefer, Ben Bonk, many of you will remember, brought a suitcase full of items that enlivened the discussion and said quite openly, clearly, unequivocally to candidate Bush, Americans will die from terrorism during your presidency. We had just been through, of course, the Africa embassy bombings and the USS Cole. And Dennis Wilder was the China expert, who again could go as deep as anyone wanted to go. And then when I briefed Kerry, because of the continuing and growing concern about domestic matters, particularly on terrorism, I asked John Pistol, who was the deputy, the number two at FBI, to come with me, and he did a fine job. So important not to try and be the only person in the spotlight in these things if you can avoid it.
Right. And this bit about operational intelligence can become problematic. In 1960, the Eisenhower administration was planning an attack on Cuba. Richard Nixon, the vice president, knew about this. During the presidential debates, John Kennedy accused the Eisenhower administration of not doing enough about Cuba. Nixon obviously couldn't say, hey, we have a plan underway. And Nixon was convinced after that Kennedy had been briefed on what became the Bay of Pigs, although apparently he was not, and felt that he had been betrayed, quote unquote, by CIA. And that really began the downward slope of Richard Nixon's attitude towards the Central Intelligence Agency. In his second set of memoirs, he somewhat fudges the issue, but in his first set of memoirs, he's very straightforward that Kennedy knew and he put me on the spot and it was CIA's fault. So we don't do operational for obvious reasons, but it has come up as a partisan issue, at least in 1960. Dawn, you were going to say something.
Oh, I was just going to say that to follow up on John and Peter, that in 2016, the same thing, the very senior briefer was comfortable in most areas of the world, but did take experts. And the other unique thing about 2016 was bringing an FBI counterintelligence expert to talk about election threats to the campaign, the technology threat and the other threats. And that was at the request of the president, that both campaigns be informed of the actual threat against their campaign structure.
John Mosman, in your experience, which of these transitions has gone best and why?
In terms of transition after the election,
yeah.
2008 to me is the gold standard of a transition. President Bush decided and made it very clear to the government that it was going to be a wartime transition. You know, we had activity both in Afghanistan and Iraq, obviously, and he made it very, very clear that he wanted the incoming administration, no matter who it was, to be fully briefed and aware of the seriousness of the national security issues. So what happened in my mind, the best part of that transition was the offer by the intelligence community to provide a series of briefings. This was actually at the request of Susan Rice and Jonathan Steinberg, coordinated with Jeremy Bash, where right after the election, we got a request that briefers come down and start talking about various parts of the world, various threats that the United States faced. There were a series of about 25 of those briefings that took place. It was almost like Old Home Week. I mean, the NIC was sort of coordinating all of this. Very senior briefers would get down to the GSA facility, which had a classified room. The people that had been out of office for sometimes 8 years would be reacquainted with people that they had dealt with in their past. The dialogue was rich, and it was hugely important. The same offer was made in 2016. Unfortunately, it was not accepted. It was a different transition. And if I had to compare and contrast the two, the Bush 2008 to Obama was the best, the very best. I would not give the same high mark to the last transition, which I think was about a C-, partly because this has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with the fact that the Trump transition team was basically fired about a week or so after the election. The ones we had been dealing with, Dawn had been dealing directly with Governor Chris Christie and former Congressman Mike Rogers. Dawn had had a number of different discussions with them about the nuts and bolts of the transition, what we were prepared to offer, and they disappeared about a week after the election. So,
yeah, that makes it much harder.
Yep.
Obviously, this is a political issue. I mean, we are nonpartisan with the intelligence community, but this is all taking place in an intensely partisan atmosphere. And I don't care which election we're talking about; they're all very intensely partisan. So, how do you keep the politics out of this when you're setting this up and when you're actually doing the briefings? John Mclaughlin?
Well, it's tricky. It's tricky. I often say, as a number of you do, I know I teach these days, and one thing I say to graduate students at Johns Hopkins is, intelligence is not politics, but it lives in a political world, and it's surrounded by politics all the time. I think when I was doing this, the closest I came to that kind of experience was, in one case, just a casual remark, and in another case, a very direct question. The casual remark was from candidate Bush, who quite frequently during the briefing would say, well, when I'm president, and he would then say something critical about the situation in the world we were talking about. And of course, you just ignore this and move along. So that's one way to deal with it, is you don't engage on issues that could draw you into a discussion about the merits of what the current government is doing. The second example I would give you, of course, was in 2004. I was briefing Senator Kerry in the midst of probably the most controversial period of the Iraq War. And Iraq was at the center of the whole campaign debate. So he was intensely interested in that. And at one point said to me when I was briefing him in Boston, look, tell me exactly what you tell President Bush about Iraq. And it wasn't a political question, but I think it carried a bit of a message that he wanted to make sure that we weren't spinning anything for him in a way that didn't match what President Bush was getting. And we weren't. And our answers to him, I think I was by myself on that one, was just very direct in terms of what we were telling Bush, which at that time was full of pretty bad news. So, if the candidate wanted to take what we were telling him as a non-political, objective, as best we could be, statement, they could take it and use it politically. I did not detect that he did that. I felt he simply wanted to know what's the ground we're standing on here.
Also in 2004, and you know this much better than I do, the Wall Street Journal, Vice President Cheney's staff was accusing the CIA of favoring Senator Kerry. Which,
all through this period, we were accused of leaking material from intelligence sources that would somehow make the Bush administration look bad. I think I can assure this audience that was not happening. In fact, I called President Bush at one point at his ranch in Crawford and said very directly to him, the CIA is not leaking material to hurt you. If anyone is, it's probably coming out of opponents somewhere within the policy community, because that's typically where intelligence leaks. We never know with confidence, but that was my judgment at the time based on what I could determine confidently.
So would you say, I mean, we've had several elections where either the incumbent president is running or a sitting vice president, Humphrey George Bush the elder, Al Gore is running. Is that more difficult because you have somebody who's inside and is already getting briefings and somebody who's outside?
I think that those elections are sensitive for us because we're required to do transition activities, and now that's part of the law.
Right.
And yet you don't want to make it look like you're expecting the incumbent that you're briefing every day is going to lose. And so it is tricky. Those years have always been sensitive. We label the planning contingency planning. We're very careful about how we do it. But I will say that Congress has made it easier for us in various amendments to the Presidential Transition Act of 1963. They've really codified a lot of the Bush era transition processes. You have to have a career federal transition manager appointed by the White House, a White House transition council. There's a structure that we can turn to in terms of we're operating within a larger government congressionally mandated structure. And I think that does make it a little easier this time because you have a whole panoply of things you have to do. And the Intelligence Reform Act of 2004 requires us to clear people for the campaign so that if there is a transition, they have national security folks already cleared on day one after the election. And so again, we have a legal basis, but despite that, it's still sensitive, obviously, because you're out there dealing with the other side while you're providing day-to-day intelligence to the president.
And this is an important point. I don't think most people realize there is a formal legal process. It's not this haphazard group of two camps talking to each other or not. There is actually a set of legal requirements that most people are totally unaware of. John Mosman.
Back to the issue of how to keep politics out of it. Don will recall Jim Clapper, when he was DNI, decided that no political appointee should be involved in the candidate briefings. He thought that that would just take one issue out of play. The other thing that maybe we went overboard about it, but when you had, again, a non-incumbent race in 2008 and 2016, we went overboard to, as I said before, send the same messages to both camps. An issue came up in at least our mind in 2016 when candidate Trump did not get through all of the briefing material in the first briefing in New York City. Governor Christie called Dawn and said, we need to do another one, and another one was put on. There was a lot of publicity about candidate briefings back in that election, too much in my mind. But we wanted to make absolutely sure that the opponent, Secretary Clinton's campaign, did not think we were doing more for Mr. Trump than we had done for her. So we sent a note, and we basically said the only reason there's going to be a second briefing is because they didn't get through the topics that you've already been briefed on. Pragmatic, maybe overcompensating, but again, it was the idea that we did not want to appear to be favoring anyone over the other.
Right. We've touched a little bit. I want to move past the election to the transition. We've begun to touch on that. In the year 2000, we had a contested election. It wasn't solved until the end of the first week of December. So what happens in that kind of case where there is no winner? What is what happens to the briefings, and how does the intelligence community deal with that scenario?
Well, in that scenario, again, it's discussions with the White House. And in that particular case, I think at the end of November, the president said, go ahead and brief candidate Bush as if we are going to have a transition, and went ahead and authorized it while the court case was still pending. And so you have to deal with those scenarios, and that was very unusual. But again, you have to have the conversations with the White House on when do you want to start these transition activities.
Mm-hmm. And again, the White House is in control of this to some degree. John Mclaughlin, you have a lovely story about the transition period and and your interaction with President-elect Clinton.
Oh, many stories. Yeah, we were in Little Rock, Arkansas for about 3 months. I was alternating every couple of weeks with John Helgerson, who was then the Deputy Director for Analysis, and who wrote the book on all of this, by the way. And one of the things you learn in that situation where you're co-located with the candidate is you kind of have to recruit the staff, the administrative staff, because you are an interloper here. You're this person who shows up every morning while they're trying to get business done for a president-elect. and cabinet candidates are showing up for meetings and interviews and such, and you're in there with the president-elect at 7:30 in the morning. And if he gets too interested and you're in there for an hour, they get very impatient because people are stacking up to see him. So at one point, they came to me and said, you know, young man, if you don't get out of there in 20 minutes, this is done. This is over. So I had to figure out a way to, because Clinton was simply interested in all of this. He was a sponge for everything, and smart and knowledgeable, and asked a lot of questions, and you know, couldn't get enough as he prepared to be president. And so I had to figure out a way to diplomatically say at about 20 minutes, well, thank you, Governor. I know people are waiting to see you, and ease my way out of the room, which wasn't too hard. Sometimes Chelsea would be doing her homework in the room next door, and he would have to go in there, and then I would slip away while he was gone.
You should tell your story about the briefing on the morning of the inauguration.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh yeah, well, I followed him right up to Inauguration Day, and it was my duty to brief him on the day of inauguration. He was in Blair House, just across the street from the White House, of course, where a president-elect stays. And I showed up at 7 in the morning, and I had to get through the police line, which was surrounding this entire block. So I went up to the police line, and I had a credential, and I said, I'm the CIA briefer for the president, and I need to get in there. And their reaction was, yeah, right, that's a new one. We haven't heard that one before. So it took about 15 minutes to actually prove. I had to make some phone calls and, you know, jolly them up a good deal, and eventually they let me through. And so I make my way into the Blair House, and Clinton is upstairs at that point. But already what happens after an election is people begin to surround a president-elect. It was a little easier in Little Rock because surprisingly, he had only one foreign policy advisor there, Nancy Soderberg, and she was very accommodating and helpful. But once you're that close to actually sitting in the Oval Office, people are beginning to circle around you, everyone from the Secret Service to your close advisors. And most people just told me, he doesn't have time for you this morning. Just, you know, stand over in the corner. And so I did. And this was coming mainly from his national security advisors. I saw at one point, things you see, Brent Scowcroft going up the stairs to meet him upstairs, and he had a military aide with him carrying a briefcase, and I just assumed this was the nuclear codes briefing. Clinton came down, dressed for morning church services, and caught out of the corner of his eye, I'm standing over in the corner, and to my great eternal pleasure, he cut through the crowd and came right over to me. To the chagrin of his advisors, I think, and asked, do you have anything for me this morning? And fortunately, I was able to say, based on the events of that day, no, Governor, all clear today. No one is going to give you any trouble that we are aware of, so Godspeed. And that was it. I think I might have mentioned one thing about the Persian Gulf, but that was more or less in a reassuring way. And turns out, thankfully, that was correct on that day. So you encounter a lot of situations where you have to play it by ear and be quick on your feet, literally, actually, in that case.
I just want to mention, we've been talking about the perils of partisanship and making sure we appear nonpartisan. There's an instructive story from the Truman administration in 1948. Everybody assumed that Thomas Dewey would be elected. The head of the Secret Service went to New York on election night to be at Dewey's headquarters for the transition. Of course, Dewey lost. The head of the Secret Service managed to slink out of the room and get back to Washington. The next morning, Truman found out about this and fired him. So there are perils. There's really serious perils, and we try very, very hard to make sure that that doesn't. And we're fairly successful, I think, at being. We did have this flap in 2004.
I'll tell you one other little story about being in Little Rock. We managed to hide out at a Comfort Inn, which was a very low budget hotel in that city, right next to a Waffle House, which is where we ate for 3 months. And the press never discovered us there. That was the amazing thing. We had a suite there in which we put in a lot of commo gear and so forth. So one morning, I wanted to have a photo with the president-elect. And this was arranged for one morning, and he had just come in from a long run. He was kind of dripping wet in a sweatsuit. And that was the moment when we were going to take this photo. It's in my office today. And we're standing there side by side, and I'm dressed kind of like this, and he's dripping wet in a sweatsuit. And he looks at me and says, when they see this, they're going to wonder which one was elected president.
We're going to go to questions in a few minutes. Some other questions I want to ask the panel, though. Biggest successes or most awkward moments from your experience in doing these? John Mosman?
Well, the most awkward moment I think we've already talked about, and that was the first Obama PDB briefing in Chicago after the election, when the DNI McConnell went to Chicago, and there were a number of people in the room outside the office that also expected to be in the briefing, including Rahm Emanuel and a number of people that expected to be part of the administration. But again, the White House had not authorized that. So the DNI had to inform the president-elect that he couldn't include those people. And it got them off to a rather rocky start, I must say. It was very embarrassing. We think we've corrected that in 2016. Again, the DNI, Jim Clapper, sent a memo to the chief of staff and outlined a program by which when an official was designated by the president-elect as chief of staff, national security advisor, secretary of state, secretary of defense, when those designations were made, then PDB briefers could be assigned.
And I think in 2016, the real difficulty was the amazing congressional and press interest in our activities. It started with Congress writing to the DNI, don't brief Hillary Clinton, she'll put classified information on her email. And then you had folks writing in the press, you shouldn't brief Trump, he'll put it on his Twitter account. We became part of the political story. And it was unfortunate in a year when one of the candidates, candidate Trump, had no experience with the intelligence community. There was press around every briefing. He would make comments, intelligence officials might respond back, which made him wonder, are we leaking things? It was a very awkward time because of that intense press interest. And I'm glad to see this year that we really haven't heard anything, which is the way it should be, because we don't want to be part of the story.
Absolutely. This is supposed to take place under the radar. John Mclaughlin.
Yeah, I wasn't there for this, but some of you may remember this from the Bush transition. I believe Winston Wiley or Michael Morrell, one of them was the briefer when Bush, after receiving the PDB a few days, said something to the effect of, when do I get to see the good stuff? And this, of course, sent a shockwave of horror through the ranks, because we thought we were giving him the good stuff. But it turns out what he really meant was he wanted to see more operational material. Right? Now the president-elect. And of course, the PDB at that point was principally finished analysis, maybe 12 pages worth of that. Exciting enough, but not with the swashbuckling tales of what's going on in the back alleys of various capitals around the world. And eventually he did get more of that, of course. In fact, I think we started giving it to him then. The other awkward moment I'd mention is when I was briefing Clinton, and this brought to mind something that was a lesson learned, is the briefer has to be in very close touch with what's going on in Washington. And sometimes then, I don't think this would happen now, but then I was left out of some things that were going on. And in that year, just as he was getting ready to leave office, President Bush sent something like 20,000 troops into Somalia to deal with a humanitarian disaster. I didn't know about this.
This is President Bush the Elder, for those of you who are wondering. This is 1992.
Right, be Bush 41.
Right.
And very few people in Washington knew about it. It was very close hold because of the nature of the operation. But Clinton was asked about this while he was on his morning run, and he came back and was very angry with me. The only time he really kind of lost his temper about why I had let him be surprised by this. And of course, I hadn't known about it, so I had to jump on the phone right away. I just basically said to him, apologies, Governor, but I'll have the complete details for you within a half hour or so, and got on the phone and got that sorted out. But that's something to guard against when you're doing this, is particularly a president-elect expects to be in the loop on things. And if you leave him out of the loop, you're off to a very bad start. We healed it over, but it was a rocky moment.
Peter?
Just a variation on this issue. Once there's a winner after the election and it's a different person, depending on their background, whether they had much experience in international affairs or know much about the intelligence world, one of the challenges in producing the President's Daily Brief was you still have a sitting president. He gets the book, or he or she gets the book, as they always do. But the new person is now getting that book for the first time. And if you're a reader and you're diving into a subject where you don't have much background, you're looking at this and it's like starting Anna Karenina with chapter 5. Like, who are all these characters? What happened in the first 5 chapters? So what you have to do, the way we try to deal with this, was we actually produced what we call a facing page with the basic facts and background. Essentially, how did we get here? What are the key things you need to know about the Iranian nuclear program or the North Korean missile program? How far along are the key data points, so they have some context when they read that day's particular piece, which is written for someone who's been studying the Iran program now maybe for 4 years or 8 years.
Right.
So it's something to have to think about, and also delicately, because they are aware of the fact you're doing this other book.
And Jim Clapper has this great line, he has many great lines, but he has this great line: the history of rock and roll did not begin the day you turned on the radio. And so this is an important issue. I mean, they're coming in literally in the middle of a story and getting them up to speed. They will become more facile over time, but getting them up to speed is a difficult process. Let me ask one last question, then we're going to go to our audience for questions. Any recommendations on how the process might be changed or improved? I mean, it now is a very formal process, as Dawn has pointed out, but any ideas on things that might still go better each time around? Peter, and then John Mosman.
Sure. One that's come up frequently, and I know that several people in this room have talked about this. I'm a big fan of having what I would call Intelligence 101 for the entire incoming national security team. For a lot of people who have never been in government or haven't been in there for 4 years or 8 years, a lot changes in our business, certainly say on the cyber side. If you're not up to speed on that, you really need to hear from NSA or DIA or all the key elements of the community. What's changed and what's new? How can we help you? What are the kinds of products we produce these days? What's the new capabilities that we have in the intelligence world that can help you be better informed and make hopefully better decisions?
That's a really good point. John Mosman and I know a really good Intelligence 101 class.
Yeah,
John,
exactly.
go ahead.
Exactly. You know, on Intelligence 101, that idea has been tried. Briefings have been put together. One of the frustrations over the years has been the people coming into the administration simply don't have time for a lot of those kinds of briefings, and a lot of them don't appreciate the reason for them. So one of the suggestions I've had over the years is, when you're briefing on a given subject with either a briefing team like in 2008 or singly, try to work into the briefing the mechanics if you can. Do it through an actual substantive briefing where the recipient understands what the substance is, but also sort of how we're getting there. That to me is a more pragmatic approach. The only other thing is really maybe in the weeds, but Dawn mentioned the enormous amount of publicity that took place in 2016. A lot of it was negative. A lot of it was childish and politically driven. One way maybe to overcome that is for a press release to be issued before the candidate briefings take place, probably through the White House, and simply say, the president has authorized the following to take place. Here are the basic ground rules. That's all we're going to say about it. And just sort of get out of the play of the politics of the moment. We haven't seen that this year, thank God, but in 2016, it was very ugly.
John Mclaughlin, you want to say something?
No.
Okay, we're going to thank you all. That was, again, a terrific discussion. Raleigh, you're going to handle the question and answer for us. Questioners can ask a specific panelist or just throw it as a free throw, and we will work it out from there. Raleigh, over to you.
Okay, great. Before we get started on questions for the panelists, I want to answer a question that's for us, FPRI, which is, will this be recorded and will it be available? Yes, this is all being recorded. You can watch it again, and it will be on FPRI's YouTube channel, which you can reach. I think we put a link in the chat box, as well as you can find it on our website, or Google YouTube FPRI, and you'll be able to find this. Okay, we have a question from Ed Mclaughlin, as well as a question from an anonymous attendee, and they're basically the same, and they are about whether Vice President Biden is getting briefings right now, and would he already have been getting briefings just because he's a former vice president? Is he entitled to briefings anyway because of that? Is that at the White House discretion as well? And are there levels of that? So the anonymous attendee says, would you say something like, Mr. Biden, you already know X, but as the nominee, we need to tell you why. So was he already getting something, and what's he getting now?
Ron, do you want to handle that? Or not?
I think as far as I know, the fact that you're a former official does not give you any entitlement to current briefings, because you're not in a position. You get the briefings as any candidate would get. Obviously, the intelligence community briefers probably know more about his style and how he takes information, which is probably a leg up for preparing the briefings. I do know the press reported that he was briefed on, I think, 16 September. But again, we haven't seen much in the press this time, which is good. But I know that the press did report at least one briefing.
And I believe former presidents get, they have the offer of, and most do get, a daily summary of intelligence if they want it. And I know, thinking back, it was President George H.W. Bush who quite frequently would come in for a briefing on something. And Ronald Reagan, on one occasion at least, because I was there, requested a briefing before a couple of his foreign trips.
I have a question from Carlos Rivers. Who of the various candidates has been the most interested on international affairs?
John Mosman?
I probably won't say, but I think, because I think they all, and John Mclaughlin and Peter are better at this than I, because they've been briefing senior officials. But one mark of whether the briefings are making a difference to the candidate is whether they ask for more. An example, Senator Obama was briefed in Chicago on Labor Day in 2008. And he wanted it to focus primarily on counterterrorism. So as John Mclaughlin mentioned, the DNI took out the deputy director of FBI, as well as the head of the counterterrorism center at that time. And they spent most of the time talking about terrorism. McConnell then brought in several other subjects that he was prepared to talk about. Obama said, this is great. I'm going to set a whole day aside before the election so we can have more deep dive briefings. And the staff called us after the briefing, and I said, good luck. That's never going to happen. I mean, there's no way a candidate's going to carve out an entire day for this.
Right.
Congressman Ryan in 2012 broke a record. He had 4 briefings. Governor Romney had 2 briefings. So I think a mark of interest is whether they want more.
Michael Morell has pointed out that Governor Palin was very interested in foreign policy and asked how would she relate to these issues, which is kind of interesting. Peter, do you ever want to add something to this?
Maybe the Palin briefing, just quickly, it was also during the week of UNGA, the UN General Assembly meetings in New York City. And Peter can tell you how complicated it was to get the briefing teams up there at that time. But Governor Palin, after the substantive classified briefings, also wanted unclassified biographies about a number of the dignitaries she was going to meet that week. Again, a mark of how important intelligence was to at least that campaign.
Peter?
Two quick stories. One, that briefing, we got notice that she wanted that briefing literally, I think, on 1 or 2 days' notice.
Right.
And it was because she was going to be in New York, and conveniently all the world's leaders would be in New York. So she actually wanted to meet some of them.
Right.
So we had to go find a hotel room. For those of you who are New Yorkers, getting a hotel room during Unga Week is like almost impossible. And if it wasn't for some
during Unga Week,
some good friends of mine in other parts of the agency who had good contacts managed to get us several rooms for the briefers. And then you had to have the technical people who had to sweep the room and so on. There's a point I wanted to stress here. One of the things I liked about 2008 and working with John Mosman, since we were counterparts essentially, was getting all the wheels moving for the logistics, the communications, the security of making these briefings happen, which is a nightmare to try to manage. And it was the best, for me, it was the best experience to watch serious professional people in a nonpartisan way work constructively. Nobody's getting credit here. We all had to do this or we would all look bad. And it was really one of the highlights for me. The other thing I would stress in terms of interests of candidates, one of the things the intelligence, CIA produces for the president-elect, literally the day they're elected, the next morning, they're given a book called, People Who Are Going to Call You book. And John knows this well. So basically, because a lot of world leaders will be calling them to congratulate them, we get a book with basically the basic facts and bios and a little context, the kinds of things they might raise if they want to try to elicit something from you. We want to warn you so you don't step into anything right out of the gate. And we deliver this book to the staffers actually beforehand. You can't just give it to them the morning of. So there's some delicate diplomatic work that goes on and arranging for the preparation and then the handoff to the appropriate people so the president-elect is ready to go that morning. And of course, you don't know who's
right.
going to win. In 2008, one final point, and I'll stop. The logistics of this, the briefers are supported by commo people and security people, logistics. So, and they're in 4 different parts of the country. In 2008, it was Alaska, Arizona, Delaware, and Chicago. And so you have little teams and they go to some relatively inexpensive hotel like John Mclaughlin mentioned, and you set up shop with a laptop and some printers and make this thing happen to get all this material going. It's really an amazing piece of machinery to watch, and it works pretty well.
Good point.
I have a 2-part question. Sylvia Baker, you've partially answered to this. Do vice presidential candidates get briefings? But the other question I want to ask is my own question. What are the dynamics of the briefings when there's a sitting president who's running for re-election and he loses? And I'm thinking of Bush 41. And of course, who knows what's going to happen on November 3rd, but can anyone comment on that?
Well, Helgerson in his book makes it clear that George Bush 1 was extremely gracious and really made the transition period work well in terms of making sure that the intelligence community could provide the information that the president-elect needed.
And on the vice presidential question, I think, in my experience, they are briefed when they ask for such a briefing. I believe, I was not involved, but I believe Vice President candidate Cheney was briefed. Mm-hmm. And I did personally brief Kerry's running mate, John Edwards, who showed up, I think this was at a hotel in Nashville or somewhere. You show up almost anywhere, and he had two aides with him. And we spent maybe 2 hours, and it was just one briefing. But yes, they're entitled, and if the sitting president agrees. That's the only one I'm aware of.
Can you talk about, this is from Bobby Brady, can you comment about the impact of COVID-19 on these briefings?
Yeah, what's that, Peter?
Well, I can't say that I have any insight into this, to be honest.
Okay.
Wear a mask.
I am sure that I am sure that's part of the process this year, to make sure that both the briefers and the candidates are safe. I can't imagine that wouldn't be part of the process.
But
John Mosman.
actually, it brings up another point that maybe not related to the virus, but one of the things that we had to continually remind the briefing teams, who, as Peter said, would be notified at the last minute to get on a plane and go somewhere. The briefing schedule is really dependent on the candidate schedule. You have to basically be prepared to run all over the country to do briefings. In 2012, I think Governor Romney had the first briefing in Los Angeles. Then he had one in Northern Virginia. Ryan had one in DC, in Boston, I think it was, in Reno. I mean, all over the country. So you really have to be prepared to go anywhere. I suspect, without knowing, I suspect that this year is extremely complicated because of that. It's just not easy to hop on planes anymore and go to briefings.
Good point.
We have an interesting question from an anonymous attendee, and this is, how do you protect critical intelligence that's part of these briefings from becoming political fodder in debates or rallies? And presumably there's a counterintelligence issue to this, sensitive information potentially getting out.
Well, I mentioned what happened in 1960, the issue of whether or not Kennedy was briefed on the Bay of Pigs operation, which he was not. That's the most glaring precedent where operational intelligence became a political issue, at least in the mind of one of the candidates. I think that's sort of the high or low point for that. But I'll leave this to the other, John Mosman.
Well, the only other time that, at least in my experience, a candidate talked about what happened in a briefing was in 2016. That you may remember there was a commander-in-chief forum that NBC News put on, a separate session with Mr. Trump and a separate session with Secretary Clinton. Mr. Trump had just had his first briefing, and in the course of that discussion with Matt Lauer, Mr. Trump said something to the effect that I've been briefed by these intelligence people, and I could tell by their body language that they don't agree with Obama's policies. That, to me, was the first and only time a candidate remarked about something politically, that gave a political comment to a briefing. Unfortunately, it caused a lot of other people, former intelligence people primarily, to come out and criticize him for that. But it was a pretty tough moment, I must say.
You know, Raleigh, that's a really interesting question, and I'll just think out loud about it for a moment, because one thing it reminds me of as we think of events in the last couple of years is how much compliance with rules is voluntary. So in a way, I'm thinking back on my experiences doing these things, I've always just assumed that, I've just made the assumption that the person I'm briefing is trustworthy and discreet, and given that they might be president, is going to protect this material. But then you have to make judgments about how far you're going to go, even if you're taking operational material off the table. I know when I was preparing to brief candidate Bush, someone in the Clinton administration, because I had asked, do you have any guidance? And one of the pieces of guidance was, well, give him what he needs to know, but be careful about anything sensitive. That was the extent of the guidance. And so you have to figure out, in your own judgment, what does this person need to know? And I've gone pretty far down the road toward bringing them in as much as I could to what I understood to be going on across the board. Again, on the assumption that if this person is going to be president, they have to walk in ready. And if they're not going to be president, they're a loyal American. You can trust them to tuck all of this away in their lockbox and move on. Now, if we can't do that, we're in trouble. Right. But that's kind of how I've thought it through when I faced this.
Peter, did you want to add something to that?
No, I was going to actually ask John to make that point. So we're good.
Okay. Well, you know, I think we've already touched on this, but clearly we are now dealing with a much more formal, regularized process when we transition to the DNI than what we had under the DCI system. So clearly there's more structure to the process than there was before. So at what point does a president-elect, assuming that, at one point in open elections, one of them is going to be president-elect, when do they start to get operational information, covert action briefings and things like that? When does that happen?
That's varied over time. And again, the intelligence community asked the White House's approval. I think most president-elects have been briefed on covert action. I'm trying to remember what John Helgerson had to say about that. I think maybe President-elect Clinton, they waited until he took office. But again, I think to Bush, he viewed it as a wartime transition. So he was very forward-leaning on the provision of information to the president-elect.
Peter?
I've always argued, and I can only give the one example of the transition to Bush, that it was important to bring them in once it was clear they were going to be president. It's important to bring them into that. And why? Well, many people in the audience will know that covert action only happens when a president in ink affixes a signature to something called a finding, which goes back to the language of the Hughes-Ryan Act in 1974, which says covert action is authorized when a president finds that it is required to deal with a national security problem overseas. So I've always thought of it as something that's very personal to a president. So they need to know right away what's happening under the signature of their predecessor in the event it's not what they want to do. So just as a matter of principle, I think once the mantle is conferred, you got to bring them in.
And also, these things don't happen in nice, neat 4-year blocks of time. There's going to be overlap. Operations that are underway in one administration are going to still be underway, and they need to know that this is happening. Peter, you wanted to say something also.
Yeah, during the 2008 transition, we absolutely did a whole range of briefings for the Obama team that was coming in. And my recollection is we spent more than a day covering all of the covert action programs, every single one of them, because they had to know. What am I inheriting? Is this going to affect an area where perhaps I have a different policy objective and I need to know about this?
And during the Truman was against intervening in Iran in 1953. Eisenhower was more willing to do it. Mm-hmm. And there's a major change. The CIA is told point blank, we don't like Mossadegh, so start planning. So things will change. John Mosman.
I think I can say this, but to John McLaughlin's point about how presidents view covert action, a president wanted to do the briefings himself to the incoming president. Didn't happen. In fact, the DNI and the CIA director ended up doing them together. But that's how important a president thought these programs were.
We have a comment from, and a bit of a question from one of our longtime senior fellows, Lawrence Husick, who notes that Daniel Ellsberg was tasked to brief Henry Kissinger after Nixon won the election, and later wrote about the radical effect that being read in had on Kissinger's worldview. Can you comment generally on the effect you may have seen on candidates for the presidency? And I'm going to pair that with another question from Harvey Rishikock, who asked, when you brief presidents on covert action and other president-elects on covert action and other operational matters, have you ever seen them really disagree with one of them?
Those are
John Mosman and then John McLaughlin.
I'll defer to John on this.
Okay.
Well, those are tough questions. I have not seen someone recoil from a covert action in my time. Now, that may have happened subsequent to my experience. I have seen a new administration want to deepen a covert action, that is, to go further or to ask, why aren't we doing X? So that is the case. On the issue of, that's about all I can say and should say on that. On the case of whether the Kissinger example, whether having intelligence information revealed is somehow, a blindingly important revelation, I don't think most of the time that is the case. Except there are, as many people in this audience will know, a few sensitive programs that actually never have leaked. And when you take them into those, there is a kind of gee whiz quality to the reaction. I mean, one of the things about the intelligence community is a lot of the really successful and sensitive things it does are so extraordinary that most people would not imagine that anyone would even try to do that. And so when you take the lid off of those, you do get a gee whiz reaction, and usually an approving one.
John Mclaughlin, I recall one time you and I were coming back from a White House meeting on the priority system, and you described this arc that they come into office and they're, gee whiz, they're wowed, and as long as they stay, they say, okay, that's fine. Now can I see the good stuff? So they go from wow, gee whiz to jaded. You described it, as I recall, in sort of like a 4-year arc.
Yeah. What I was trying to say is it's such a responsibility for the intelligence community to understand this, because when you first begin speaking with them, they're all smart and well informed, or they wouldn't have arrived at that position. But you do, A, bring them into a lot of things, and B, they begin to have experiences beyond what you have. At one point in their immersion here, hearing about these foreign leaders is revelatory. 2 years later, they may have met most of them and know things about them that you don't know at the same level of granularity up close. And so the value you have to add becomes harder as this arc goes along as they gain experience and form their own opinions. And that also puts a premium on having intelligence officers who either have deep substantive expertise as analysts, or intimate street knowledge and up close knowledge as operations people overseas, in order to have the kind of authenticity to keep up with them as they mature in office and gain sophistication. So there is this arc that occurs.
George Shultz, to the latter part of his term as Secretary of State, was increasingly dissatisfied with the Soviet analysis he was getting from us in INR and from CIA. And at one point he said in a staff meeting, I've met the Soviet foreign minister 20 times. Can anybody else in this room say that? Now, he knew what the answer was, and he said to me later, we had an exchange, he said, I was meeting people who bore no resemblance to the briefings I was getting. And he felt there was an interesting disconnect, because at a certain point, he did know more about what these people were like. And it is an interesting issue that we face. At a certain point, they're going to have experiences, A, that they don't share, and B, that they know and it's filtered differently.
To get back to that question about, has an incoming administration had problems with covert actions, I think in 2008, many of the post 9/11 operational activities had been leaked to the press. And so there was a lot of discussion during the campaign. Candidate Obama had very firm views on some of those programs. So I would say in 2008, there were programs that ended or changed direction because of the candidates' views on those programs.
John Mosman.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because you may remember that President Obama, days after the inauguration, issued 3 executive orders. One was to review interrogation procedures, the other was to review the detainees in Guantanamo, and the third was to establish detention policy. So to Don's point, that's probably the clearest example of where a previous administration's activities were formally thought through by a new president.
We have a question from Keith Fennell, and it's on how difficult is it to convey some of the nuances of intelligence, such as the reliability of sources, the differing degrees of access of sources, vetting issues. Care to comment on that?
I personally have found this is one of the most difficult things to do. And we ran into this problem after the infamous Iraq weapons of mass destruction estimate. And I commissioned a paper that Bob Walpole wrote that tries to explain estimative language and explain what is a high confidence source and a medium confidence source. It is a wonderful piece of paper. It's unclassified. If you go online and look up what we mean when we say, and it was interesting to me, I mean, Bob wrote this paper after the estimate in 2003, and it was used as part of the intellectual basis for the DNI's report on Russian interference in the election in 2017, in January 2017, to try to explain to people how we do this. It is a very difficult thing to do, to explain, what is a high confidence source? What does it mean when we make an assessment or a judgment? Because we're speaking a language among ourselves that we're very facile with. And now you're dealing with somebody who is bright, as John Mclaughlin said, but they don't speak intelligence. And so you have to be able to explain to them what we mean when we say it, as the title of Bob's paper says.
I think this is a hard thing. It's manageable, but it's very hard. And why? Well, because they're policy people and candidates and politicians. And we are these people who look at things clinically, dryly, skeptically. And so those are two very different cultures. They're used to taking information of varying quality and transforming it into a persuasive argument, whereas we're used to taking information, squeezing it and down to a core of that's reliable, and then saying the minimum thing we can say about it and adding some speculation. So those are very different cultures. I've always found that they get impatient with nuance often, and they get impatient with a lot of explanations of what Mark just laid out, as useful as it is, because it's so alien to their world. I mean, a simple way that I've thought about dealing with this, and that is a real lesson coming out of the Iraq mess, is when you're briefing, and certainly this was a well-learned early lesson, is they ask a question, you tell them what you know, and then you tell them very clearly what you don't know.
Absolutely.
And you just have to be, and the biggest mistake you can make in these candidate briefings is when they ask you a question and you know a little bit about it, and you want to answer it because you know a little bit about it. If you build much of an edifice on that tiny bit of knowledge, they'll see right through it. Why? Because that's what they do for a living. and so and they understand I don't know, because there's a lot of things they don't know. So here's what I know, here's what I don't know. And if I knew these things, here's how it would change my analysis, but I don't know these things. I could give you concrete examples on that if anyone wants them, but that's essentially the discipline.
John Mosman?
Can I make a point in terms of a real example of what John was just talking about in the 2012 candidate briefing phase? You may remember that the attack on Benghazi took place right around the anniversary of 9/11. That was right before the first Romney briefing in Los Angeles. And right before the briefing, the intelligence community had one view of what might have caused that awful event in Benghazi that resulted in the deaths of Ambassador and several other intelligence officers. The intelligence community had one view, and that view was briefed to the candidate in Los Angeles. Fast forward about 5 or 6 days, when the second briefing took place about 10 days later, the community had a different view. And the briefer, the senior briefer, made a very strong point of reminding the governor about what he had first heard and what the community's view was the second briefing. To me, that was the epitome of the professionalism of the intelligence community, to say we had one view and now it's changed and here's why it's changed. And as people have said during this panel discussion today, the first impression one gets of the intelligence community is deep-seated. And to me, that was a great example of telling a potential president, we're willing to change our view, and here's why.
It's important too, because I'm not going to cite a specific example. I'm not sure I have one, but candidates frequently come to the briefings with the intelligence community, not just the CIA, with a degree of skepticism, and just not sure whether this is going to be helpful and what our motives are. I mean, there's so many myths about intelligence, about, you all know them. And so part of your job is to dispel those myths, that we're actually here just to tell you what we think as best we can. There's no agenda.
And most presidential candidates have no previous working experience with intelligence. There are exceptions, General Eisenhower, the elder George Bush, if you're a sitting vice president, but for all the others, This is a totally novel experience. They've never had to deal with this before. They've never had to think about these things before. Now suddenly, congratulations, this is going to be on your plate first thing on January 20th. So there's that issue as well. You elect a governor of a state, and I don't care how big the state is, whether it's California or Arkansas, this is new to you. This is entirely new to you. So these briefings become very important, at least it's your first sort of dip of the toe in the water.
Yeah. Just a comment, we're running over time, but we have lots of questions. So we're gonna hang on till about 12:30. And
Okay.
a question in from Peter Swears, who asked, can you make some comments on the possible effect on the briefers? In other words, how has this experience of briefing presidential candidates affected you? What did you learn? Did it, change you?
Peter?
I wasn't a briefer in the same position John was. I briefed a vice president and national security advisor. And one of the things I came away with was how humbling it was, because you realize how many sources of information they have. I would go down and I would brief Condi and on a piece about Russia, say, where I have some background. And she'd say, well, Peter, I just got off the phone with Sergei Ivanov, and here's what he told me. It's like, okay. And also in terms of their private sector contacts, the range of people, they're amazing intelligence sources in a way. I noticed one of the questions was, does the president ever tell you and give you stuff on the people he interact with? And trust me, we try to make a practice of going down and debriefing very senior people, certainly at the end of their tours, but sometimes even when they're in the office, and say, hey, you've had 15 meetings with Shevardnadze. We would love to pick your brain for a little bit on some observations about their habits, the issues, what they seem to be most concerned about. So there's a real, for me, a real aha moment in terms of, wow, these people are even smarter than I appreciated because of the range of contacts and the kinds of information they just gobble up like sponges.
To Peter's point, and to the question, I think what Peter is saying is that briefing in this mode sensitizes you to the importance of having to add value in ways you might not experience. You wouldn't understand if you haven't had some contact with people who are doing this very difficult policy work.
Question from an anonymous attendee. At what point did President Obama ask for an iPad PDB presentation? And as part of that, can you comment on the impact of technology?
I think he wanted an iPad fairly early on, as I recall. I was sort of somewhat removed from this, but my recollection is he wanted this fairly early on. And I think people make too much of this. It's the means, not the end. It's just how you're delivering the information. And there's a downside to the iPad. They would load it up with pictures and maps. And we all know from surfing on the internet, it's very easy to fall into a rabbit hole. And the president's time is valuable and it's limited. And while you want him to be well informed and you want to go wherever the senior official wants to go in a briefing, you don't want to go so deep that you're into minutia. And so I think people make too much of the iPad experience. So Robert Cardillo is doing it, and Robert's a great briefer. But I think there was more emphasis than necessary. But if that's how the president, one of the things we're very good at is finding out, how does the president want his material? Because neither of the Bushes, as I recall, wanted maps and charts. They want text and a briefing. Ronald Reagan liked maps and charts. I mean, I remember Dick Kerr saying to me, he sat through the briefing very attentively, but he also wanted illustrations. And we're actually quite good at packaging, which we ask. There's an int, we don't always talk about, ask int. How do they like their material? John Mosman.
I was just going to say, in the candidate briefing phase, one of the responsibilities that Dawn and I and Peter had was to understand from the staff of the candidate how they received information the best. And for example, Governor Palin, who had no exposure to intelligence, had been briefed by her national security advisor, Steve Biegun, for a number of weeks in Alaska. And so when it came to the New York City briefing, we were on the phone with Steve frequently asking, what's the best way of providing information? And it wasn't a condescending question, it was a literal question, like, what's the best way of getting the information conveyed? And we got very high marks after that briefing, primarily because we put the effort into trying to figure it out.
You hear all sorts of advice from people who know them. I briefed President Reagan after he left office, several years after he left office. And I have to say, it was a good briefing. He was very well informed, very smart, very alert, very on target. But I had been told ahead of time, have a joke ready. Be ready to tell a joke about the subject you're briefing, which in that case, I think was Russia and Poland.
Well, that's just a laugh a minute. Absolutely. Dawn.
I was going to say, it's my recollection that the PDB staff itself started examining the idea of using technology before the Obama presidency. They started looking at how do you use an iPad. You could do video demonstrations, that it just offered them so many ways to present intelligence. And they had a ready and willing user in President Obama, but even if they're back to paper today, there are still other members of the national security team who like having that capability.
In 2000, Jim Clapper and I were working in the private sector, and we had a contract about how to provide intelligence to the two candidates, and this was going on through the uncertain election, electronically. And we set up a bunch of classified computers to do just that. I think it was one of the first in-QTEL contracts that we had. Peter, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think my memory is the same as yours, Dawn. I think people had been working on this electronic delivery on an iPad even before President Obama expressed his interest in doing it. And I will tell you, it was a long process because from a security perspective, this is an absolute nightmare. What if you lost one of these iPads? It's just horrifying. So without getting into all the details, they actually found a fantastic workaround, but it was a lot of work and there was a fair amount of skepticism. And I shared Mark's view too, that you can overindulge somebody. If you put hypertext links in there and they start clicking on there, there's endless rabbit holes. And we do this in other products that are distributed widely, where it's a great resource tool. You know, click on this and see the paper we wrote 4 months ago or 3 years ago. It's like this huge walking library. And that's great, but I don't know that the president needs this. Especially if they're curious about things.
I think we're just about out of time. I have one last question I can't resist asking, and it's from Doug Braidwood, who's asking whether John Mclaughlin ever used one of your magic tricks during a presentation.
No, but I'll tell you one thing. I'll do one right now. I'm just going to take a silver dollar out of the air. That's one. There's another one. And I think I have one more. Yes, there's another one. But what I did do.
You're going to make us all disappear, John, pretty soon.
When I
there's a button for
had
that.
my final farewell meeting with President Bush. And by the way, they never knew I did this. I mean, this is not something I kept this. People at CIA knew it, but I kept it kind of separate from the policy world for a variety of reasons. But when I had my farewell meeting with President Bush, I gave him a little present. And it's a rather obscure book that is written by an historian of the magic arts. And it describes Houdini's performances in Texas. And he apparently remembers this because that's one of the more unusual things someone had given him, because I know he's mentioned it to some other people at different times.
Right.
Yeah, Peter.
I have to do this, John. John was a wonderful colleague to go on foreign liaison trips with. And my favorite story, John, without getting too specific, we were meeting with a foreign service and they'd heard about John's magical talents and he agreed to do a trick. And the trick was to take a $1 bill and rip it up into little pieces and put the pieces in his hand. And magically he would reassemble it into a $100 bill. And these people came running up to him with $1 bills saying, please, please, mine. And John would always end these, and this is what I loved about turning this into a practical lesson learned for intelligence colleagues, was, see, the point is, not all things are what they appear to be. Boom, just a perfect ending.
Yeah, that's perfect. And on a perfect ending, Mark, would you like to say some final words?
Yes, please. First of all, I want to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute for hosting this event. Thanks to all of my colleagues on the panel. Thanks to our audience. I did want to mention that the Council on Intelligence Issues, like the Foreign Policy Research Institute, is a 501c3, and so you can make contributions. Go to our website. John Gannon gave you the website. I just mentioned in January, the council will be putting on a session on about Adolf Tolkachev, known as the $1 Million Spy. We will have one of the U.S. participants in this espionage case, so please look for that. Again, thanks to FPRI, and thanks to all my panelists, and thanks to the audience. Thank you all.
And thank you also to the Council on Intelligence Issues for assembling this wonderful panel. We have some events coming up, and rather than go through them, I'll just direct you to our website. Go to the events on our webpage, and you can easily see them. We have at least several events every week. So thank you again. Thank you to our supporters. Check us out on www.fpri.org, and please stay safe and well. Take care.